In this video, we're going to discuss some of the background behind component aliases and placeholders that you can use in JavaScript code. So you can see here we have a simple grid component and we have a button on the grid, and if we go back to the builder and look at the code for this button, we can see that we've written some JavaScript, and inside the JavaScript we've used some placeholders. So you can see that we've got over here grid.component name, and if I click on the insert placeholder button over there, you'll see the list of the various placeholders is displayed. So these are the placeholders for a grid component. There would be different placeholders if you were in a UX or dialog component. So you can see that in the event here we've used grid.component name as a placeholder for this component's alias, and we've also used grid.row number as a placeholder for the current row in the grid. So let's go ahead now and save this and then run it. So I'm going to go into working preview. Now in working preview we automatically assign an alias of grid1 to a grid component. So when I click this button right now, we can see that the placeholders have been replaced. So grid.component name was replaced with grid1 because that's the alias that we use in working preview, and then it says on row 1. If I click, for example, on this button over here, you can see it says grid1 on 10. So what we've shown here is how the aliases got replaced at runtime by their real values. So now let's go and look at a slightly different variant of this, where we, instead of assigning the component alias by default as we do for working preview, we explicitly set the alias. So I'm going to go now to a blank A5W page. I'll just type in, say, my page, and I'll save the page, and then I'm going to go here and insert component, and I'm going to choose the customer grid. And you can see that when I insert the customer grid, Alpha prompts for the alias that I'd like to use for this component, and it gives a default alias that is constructed from the name of the component. So I'm going to go here and call this my grid1, and then go ahead now and save, and you can see that my component got added. And now if I run this in live preview, let's go ahead now and run this component in live preview, and now press this button, you can see what it says now is my grid1 on row 2, and then of course over there would be my grid1. So when I was in working preview, whenever I pressed the button it said grid1, and now it's saying my grid1. So let's go take a look at why it's doing that. So we'll go back to design mode, and now we'll take our A5W page here and switch to source mode so we can see some of the code behind the scenes. So if we look here, we can see that in the code that got generated, the component name over here was is set to this variable called component alias, and there is component alias. So if I go here and change the component alias now from my grid1 to cust grid underbar A, and then save this, and then go ahead now and run this in live preview, and then click on the button, we can see that it's now saying cust grid A. So what we've shown at this point now is how you can control the alias when you create an A5W page, and how the curly bracket grid.component name placeholder gets replaced by the alias. So let's pause now and pick this up in the next video, where we'll explain what the significance of the alias is and what some of the other placeholders are that you can use in your JavaScript. So we're continuing now with our discussion about aliases and placeholders, and what we've shown is that when we're in working preview, the grid.component name placeholder is replaced with the alias that is used for all grids in working preview, which is grid underbar 1. So let's go now and actually run this in a browser and take a look at another significant use of the component alias. So I'm going to go now and run this component in Firefox, again using live preview now. So when you use live preview, just like working preview, we automatically assign an alias of grid 1. So you can see there, you can see it says grid 1. But now let's go and inspect one of these fields. So when I inspect the field and I look at this element in the DOM, we can see that the alias has been used here as part of the element ID. So you can see there, for example, it says grid1, which was the alias, .v, which is the namespace that everything is placed into, .r1, which indicates this is row 1, and then company name. So if I were to point now to, say, for example, this element over there, we can see that it's grid1.v.r8.company name. So the alias is being used in the element ID. So if I were to go back now to my HTML page where we specified a different alias for the component and run this now, and then let's right click and inspect this element, we can see now that the elements are no longer named grid1 etc., but they are now named custgrid underbar a.v.r8. So the alias that is defined is used as part of the element name. So why is that we're doing that? So the reason that we use the alias as part of the element name is an HTML page needs to ensure that every single ID is unique. So if I were to go back now to this page, which contains one instance of the customer grid, and go here, for example, now and say grid 2, and then I'm going to go onto this page now and insert the exact same component. So now I'm going to go there and choose customer grid there, and this time I'm going to go here and type in grid 2 as the alias. So the alias has to be unique. So now what I've got is, oh actually that didn't, let's just go here and move this after grid 2. So now what I've got is an A5W page that has two instances of the same grid. However, each instance has its own unique alias. So if I go here and run this page now, you can see that we've got our two independent instances. I can go navigate next on this instance without affecting this instance over here. And if I were to go and, for example, look at the ID of this company name field in the first grid, I can see that this one is using grid underbar 2, but if I go to this grid over here and right click, I can see that this one is using customer grid underbar A. So you can see that the alias is used as part of the element ID in the component, and this ensures that all of the elements on the page, on the HTML page or in the DOM, have unique values. So let's pause now and pick this up in the next video. So we're continuing our discussion now about component aliases and placeholders, and let's next now go and run this in the browser. We'll use Firefox, and then let's use the Firebug inspector to inspect the action on this next button over here. So I'm going to go there and then click on next, and then what I can see is that when the user clicks on the next button, there's the on-click event here that says grid underbar 1 underbar grid object dot page navigate. So what this is telling me here is that we're calling the page navigate method with the parameter of next of this grid object, and the grid object itself is called grid underbar 1 underbar grid obj. So as you recall, since we're working now in live preview, the alias was automatically set to grid underbar 1. So that's the alias, which is the same as grid.component name, and then underbar grid obj. So let's go now and see how we can create our own button that does a page navigate next. So we'll go back now to design mode, and then let's put our own button, just put another button in the grid over there. So we'll go there and then just give it a label of next, and we'll switch over to JavaScript here, so we can just start typing in JavaScript. So as you recall, we saw in the browser when we inspected the element that the method was a method of grid1 underbar grid obj. So there's a placeholder for that. So let's go now to insert placeholder, and we can see that while we've previously used grid underbar component name, this time we're going to use grid underbar object. So this is the actual object itself, and this will resolve at runtime to the alias with and then underbar grid obj. So let's go there and insert that, and then go dot page navigate, and then I'll just type in, say, next. So now this is my own JavaScript that I've just written now to navigate to the next page in the grid. So let's go ahead now and then save this, go to working preview, and then you can see that when I click this button, we're navigating to the next record. If we go now into the browser and then inspect that button, that next button over there, we can see that it automatically now has grid1 underbar grid obj dot page navigate. So even though when we defined the button we typed curly bracket grid dot object, at runtime grid dot object got resolved into this name over there, which is the actual object itself. Now advanced users can go to Firebug to the DOM, and if you look in the DOM you'll actually see there's a JavaScript object over here in the DOM called grid1 underbar grid obj. So this is the actual grid object, and if I expand that I'll get to see all of the methods and properties of this grid object. So now if we go back to our HTML page over here where we specified a different object name, so let's go back to, say, page 1 over here where we've got 2 instances of the grid, each with a different alias, and run this now. We can see that if I click this button it navigates in this grid, and if I click this button it obviously navigates in this grid. But if I were to right click and say inspect element, I can see that the on click event that we have over here is using grid underbar 2, whereas if I right click on this element and then inspect it, I can see that this element is using cust grid1 underbar a underbar grid obj. So what we've shown over here is that the placeholder, let's go back to the grid itself, that the placeholder grid.object is replaced at runtime with the real name of the grid object. So let's pause now and pick this up in the next video. So we're continuing our discussion now on aliases and placeholders, and at this point we've been demoing all of these concepts inside the grid component, but the comments all apply equally well to the UX component. So let's switch now to the UX component and discuss placeholders and aliases in the context of the UX component. So I'm going to go back to the web control panel now, and let's go ahead now and create a new UX component, and I'll just create a blank component, and I'll just put a few simple controls here, say first name, last name, and city, and then I'll go ahead now and let's go and put in a button that'll submit the component. So I'll go there and hit the submit reset button. So now if I go and look at the code that got placed in the on-click event of that button, I can see that the code is automatically using a placeholder called dialog.object. So if I go and click on Insert Placeholders, I can see that we get a very similar list of placeholders to the grid, excepting that this time they have a dialog prefix, not grid prefix, but here is dialog.object, which was analogous to grid.object. That gives me a pointer to the actual object itself. Dialog.component name is the alias of the component. And then here are some other placeholders that are useful when you write your own JavaScript, and the meaning and the use of each of these placeholders is described in the description list over here. But by far the most common aliases that you're going to use are dialog.object and dialog.component name. So again, let's go ahead now and then click OK, and then save it, and I'll go ahead now and I'll call this say UX1, and then let's also go and put a button. We'll put our own button, so we'll go to other controls and then button, and we'll just alert as we did in the case of the grid. So we'll go there and type in alert, and then we'll insert our placeholder dialog.component name, and then hit the save button, and then switch over now to working preview. And when I click this button, I can see that it shows DLG1. So what this is showing is that when we do a working preview or a live preview, the alias that is assigned to a UX component is automatically DLG1. As we showed previously in the case of a grid, the automatically assigned alias was grid1. But of course, if we create our own A5W page, so let's go here and say save page, and I'll just call this, say, page UX, hit the save button, and then if we look here in the code here, we can see that the alias over here was UX1, but I'm going to go here and change that to my UXCOMP, and then save this, and now go ahead and run it. So now when I press the button, you can see that there's the alias my UXCOMP, and that alias is going to be used in the element ID. So we'll go there and inspect the element, and we can see there's the ID of that element is my UXComp, which is the alias that we assigned, and then .v.r1.city. So what we can see here is that the naming convention used for elements in the UX component is actually very similar to the naming convention used in the grid component. We still use .v.r. So there's the alias, then .v.r, and then a row number, and .city. The only difference is that in the case of a grid, there actually are multiple rows. There's row 1, row 2, row 3, etc. In the case of the UX component, all of the elements are in row 1, so that all elements are going to have .r1 in the case of the UX component. So let's go back to the builder now and continue the discussion of aliases and placeholders. But we'll pause now and pick this up in the next video. So we're continuing our discussion now on aliases and placeholders that you can use in your JavaScript code in the UX component, and let's go now and discuss some of the other placeholders that you can use in your JavaScript code. So at this point our UX component is extremely simple, but let's go now and insert an embedded grid component. So we'll go there and we'll insert the customer grid now as a child of this UX component. So you can see now when we go to working preview, here's our UX, and then embedded in the UX is our grid component. So now let's say that we'd like to put a button on the UX that is going to navigate to the next record in the grid component. So this button that we're going to place in the grid component will be talking to another object. So let's go now and add another button. So we'll go there and say on the button text, we'll just go and give it a label to identify it. So we'll go here and we'll say navigate to next grid record, and then let's go to the event handler. So we'll go here to the click event, we'll switch to text mode, and now let's go insert placeholder. And you can see that the placeholders that we've discussed and demonstrated so far are just dialog.object and dialog.component name. But here's a placeholder for dialog.embeddedGrid. So let's go ahead now and click that, and then insert. And now we're going to need to replace this with the real ID of the grid component that we embedded. But since we don't know that yet, let's just leave this blank temporarily and then go back to this grid. And we can see here that when you embed the grid, there's the alias is automatically assigned to default alias, but that doesn't do us any good because we need to know what the alias is going to be. So we're going to go now and change that to an explicit alias. So we'll go there and type in, say, G1. So now what we've done is we've indicated that when this embedded grid object is run, we want to explicitly set the alias of that component to G1 in much the same way as we did in a previous video when we went to the HTML, to the .a5w page, and we explicitly set the alias to use for the component. So now we know that this embedded grid is going to use an alias of G1. Let's go back to our button over here, and now we can replace grid alias over there with G1. So now this placeholder is going to give us a placeholder, it's going to give us a pointer to the embedded grid. And now we can go here and say navigate page next, or I believe it might be page navigate. Well, let's just try navigate page and go ahead now and click this button. No, it is there was an error. So let's go and fix our JavaScript here and make that page navigate. Go ahead there, click the button. So now when I press this button, you can see that we're talking. So this button over here is talking to this grid, and the way in which it got a pointer to this child embedded grid was through the placeholder dialog.embeddedGrid. So the placeholders are very useful in both the grid and the UX component, and the placeholders always get replaced at runtime with real values based on the alias of the component that you're running. So I hope these videos have been useful. Thanks very much for watching.